I had always been the type of person who believed that love, once discovered, was meant to remain constant. Like a mountain weathering storms, unmoved by the winds that howled around it. I took pride in my consistency, my dependability, my unwavering commitment to doing what was expected. That certain moments arrive without invitation and carve themselves so deeply into your soul that returning to your former self becomes impossible. I never imagined I could find myself in such a situation. Please learn from what I'm about to tell you. It began on a Tuesday evening. I remember this clearly, because the light had that particular amber quality that only early spring possesses. Warm rays filtering through the living room windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood like liquid gold. I was sorting through mail at the kitchen counter when Michael rang. "Hey, Sarah," he said with that hurried inflection he adopted whenever complications arose, but he preferred not to address them directly. "Listen, something came up with that client presentation. Could you possibly handle picking up the lunch? Order from the restaurant. They're catering a small gathering for our department heads today." The catering arrangement? His firm was organizing a modest thank you meal for their executive team. Perhaps 15 people, nothing elaborate. I had assisted with the planning, selected the dishes, even confirmed the timing twice. But the caterer had contacted us that morning about a scheduling conflict, explaining they couldn't deliver until, well past 3 p.m. Michael had looked at me apologetically, and I had waved it off casually. "I'll handle the pickup myself. It's not a problem." At that moment it truly wasn't. So there I found myself, pushing through the polished chrome entrance of Harrison and Associates Strategic Planning, balancing several large takeout containers, attempting not to perspire through my light sweater. The front desk clerk acknowledged me warmly, and before I could inquire about directions, someone spoke my name. "Ms. Coleman." I pivoted and recognized him. James Harrison, the company founder, Michael's supervisor. He appeared exactly as I recalled from the office celebration months earlier. Distinguished, impeccably dressed, possessing a certain quiet authority. Perhaps 15 years Michael's senior, yet he moved with the grace of someone who remained curious about the world, someone who continued evolving. He wasn't ostentatious, simply authentic. "Allow me to assist you," he offered, approaching across the foyer with confident steps. We exchanged pleasantries during our elevator ride. He inquired about our children, praised the food selection. He recalled that I once facilitated pottery workshops at the local arts center, something I hadn't mentioned in ages. Upon reaching the meeting room, we discovered it vacant. "They're delayed in another session," he explained, placing the containers on the table. "You're welcome to stay, or I can manage from here." I paused. Something about the environment, the warm lighting, the elegant furnishings, the subtle aroma of sandalwood and aged leather, made me reluctant to leave immediately. "I don't wish to impose," I said, positioning the final package on the conference table. "You're not imposing at all," he responded, then regarded me with gentle intensity. "Actually, might you have a moment to spare?" I agreed, uncertain of my reasoning. He moved toward the large window and indicated the cityscape beyond. "Do you ever simply pause and observe at all? Not the structures themselves, but the individuals, the constant motion, each person living their unique narrative." I stepped nearer, wondering if he sought something more profound in his question. "I used to," I confessed, "before life's demands grew overwhelming." "You cease noticing when you stop anticipating discovery." James smiled subtly. "That seems unfortunate." We remained there quietly for several heartbeats, standing side by side, gazing down at the street that pulsed below like something alive. It should have felt uncomfortable. It didn't. "Michael speaks very well of you," he said, turning toward me. "That's generous of him," I replied. "We've weathered many challenges together." He's always been reliable, steady. James nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes reliable individuals overlook certain things. I sensed something shift in the atmosphere, then not physically, but emotionally. An unnamed tension. He continued, his voice softer now. There's something honorable about maintaining your chosen course. But there's also courage in recognizing when that path no longer leads to your intended destination. My breathing quickened. Slightly. I couldn't determine whether we were discussing Michael, myself, or James himself. The sound of approaching voices from the corridor disrupted whatever moment had just occurred. He stepped away, clearing his throat softly. "Thank you for delivering the meal, Sarah," he said formally. "Truly, this assistance means more than you realize." I nodded, though words initially failed me. I turned to leave, then hesitated at the doorway. "James, do you typically have such conversations with your employees' spouses?" He smiled, neither flirtatious nor arrogant, simply perceptive. "Only those who appear to have stopped anticipating discovery." I departed without glancing back, but something accompanied me home that afternoon. Something I couldn't yet identify. A question I hadn't dared pose to myself in years. And this was merely the beginning. Sleep eluded me that night. Michael lay beside me, breathing deeply, one arm resting across my waist as it had for nearly 2 decades. But I found myself studying the ceiling, that gentle glow of street lamps seeping through the blinds. My thoughts returning repeatedly to that exchange with James. It wasn't his words themselves, but his delivery, as though he perceived something within me that I had concealed long ago, and that frightened me more than I cared to acknowledge. The following morning proceeded normally. I'd prepared coffee, fed our dog, browsed my tablet while waiting for bagels to toast. Michael departed in his customary rush, planting a brief kiss on my forehead without truly seeing me. I held no resentment. We were both functioning like familiar machinery that still operated. Though less efficiently than before. Around midday, my phone chimed. Unfamiliar number. "Hello, Sarah. This is James Harrison." I froze, bagel suspended halfway to my lips. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I simply wanted to express my gratitude once more for yesterday, and I wondered if you might consider meeting me for tea sometime this week." No obligation, just conversation. There was a lengthy pause before he added, almost gently, "I believe you have more to express than you permit yourself to recognize." I should have declined. I intended to decline, but something within me, something quiet, an ancient and yearning whispered acceptance. And so 3 days later, I found myself seated across from him in a small corner bistro near the botanical gardens. I wore a soft emerald cardigan I hadn't selected in years. Not for anyone specifically, simply for myself. James had arrived first, dressed in a navy jacket, sipping something that smelled of vanilla. He rose as I entered. "You accepted," he said, as if genuinely amazed. "I did," I answered. I reasoned that if I continued contemplating our previous discussion, perhaps there was significance to it. We conversed for nearly 90 minutes, not about Michael, not primarily about business, but about literature, about creativity, about passions we once pursued before life demanded such practicality. He mentioned that he formerly composed classical guitar music. I shared that I once worked in ceramics. "You speak of it as though it belonged to another era," he observed. "Sometimes it feels that way." Eventually he leaned closer, forearms on the table, voice hushed. "Do you ever feel as though you've vanished?" The question struck so powerfully, I nearly laughed or wept. I wasn't certain which. "Yes," I whispered. He nodded slowly. "So do I." We maintained appropriate boundaries. We didn't flirt, yet there existed an intimacy in that space that enveloped us like a confidence. I left before it could develop into something more significant. I walked briskly through the gardens, my shoes clicking against stone pathways, heart racing with something I hadn't experienced in years. Recognition of myself, my presence, my vitality. When I arrived home, Michael was in his study reviewing documents, coffee mug nearby. "How did your afternoon go?" he asked without looking up. I observed him, the way he failed to notice the emerald cardigan, the way he hadn't inquired about my interests in years. "Pleasant," I said, setting down my keys. But I understood something had transformed. Not because of James, but because for the first time in memory, I felt acknowledged as an individual. And I didn't comprehend what that meant yet. But I knew it wasn't insignificant. The following days appeared tranquil externally, but internally everything had changed. I began observing details more acutely. How Michael would whistle softly while shaving. How he'd abandon his coffee cup in the identical spot on the kitchen island, consistently forgetting to wash it. How we communicated, if that term even applied. It resembled more of an information exchange. Leftovers are in the refrigerator. The car requires fuel. Did you handle that payment? No animosity existed. Simply habit. Simply time performing what time does most effectively, dulling sharpness, blending everything until the once brilliant hues of affection fade into grey. I attempted to dismiss these thoughts, convinced myself I was overanalyzing, that I was merely reacting to a random encounter with someone I scarcely knew. Then James sent a message. He didn't request anything. He simply shared an image. A basic photograph of pottery. Clay, incomplete, graceful forms rising upward as if attempting to reach toward light. Encountered this and remembered our conversation. It brought you to mind. That was his entire message. I studied it extensively. I hadn't touched clay in more than 15 years. I wasn't even certain I could still create something meaningful with my hands. But the idea lingered, persistent like a distant melody. The following week, I visited the craft supply store impulsively, purchased a small block of modeling clay, brought it home, concealed it in the basement storage room like contraband. Evening, Michael worked late at the office. I established a walk space in the basement using an old card table and a chipped ceramic bowl for water. It felt awkward initially, like attempting to recall lyrics to a song I hadn't heard in decades. But as I manipulated the clay, it became more natural, like returning to something I'd forgotten I ever cherished. I didn't mention it to anyone, particularly not Michael. But I did capture a photograph and sent it to James. His response arrived. Within minutes, "There you are." 3 words, yet they affected me profoundly. He wasn't being inappropriate. It wasn't romantic. He was simply seeing me, acknowledging the aspect of myself I'd hidden for so long. I wasn't confident it had endured. We didn't communicate frequently. But when we did, it felt like settling into warmth. No criticism, no demands, just acceptance. Then arrived the evening when everything shifted. Michael and I attended a corporate function. Formal, professional, unmemorable. Circular tables, overcooked salmon, courteous applause. I wore a navy dress I formerly adored. Elegant but conservative. Michael offered no comment. He was occupied networking with colleagues. James was positioned across the venue. We didn't interact, but at one moment I glanced up and discovered him observing me. Not in a manner that created discomfort, but in a way that made me feel vibrant. Later, that evening, I stepped onto the outdoor terrace for fresh air. The city sparkled like scattered diamonds, so alive with movement it created an ache in my chest. I heard approaching footsteps. "I suspected you might be here," James said quietly. I didn't turn around. Needed some space. He positioned himself beside me, not making contact, just near enough that I could sense his presence. "Are you content, Sarah?" he asked. The question hung in the air like mist. "I'm secure," I said after extended silence. He nodded as though he understood precisely what that implied. I faced him. "You shouldn't be here." "Perhaps not." And then, for the first time, he extended his hand, not to embrace me, simply to trace his fingertips across mine, barely perceptible, like an unspoken question. My pulse quickened, not from anxiety, from understanding. I didn't withdraw, but I didn't retreat either. And that single gentle contact transformed everything. I wish I could claim I understood my actions, that I possessed some strategy, some carefully reasoned approach tucked away, safely. But the reality is I was drowning in a sensation I hadn't known in years. A kind of silent storm beneath my skin, not desire, not imagination, something more profound. A need to be understood, to be recognized without explanation. Following that night on the terrace, I didn't encounter James for nearly 3 weeks. He didn't contact me, didn't write. Initially, I experienced relief, then disappointment, then guilt, and beneath it all, confusion. Because despite everything, I still cared for Michael in a familiar, comfortable way. Like a treasured book. No longer read, but couldn't bear to donate. One overcast afternoon, I returned to the basement. The sculpture had developed, its shape rough but emerging. 2 figures reaching toward each other, not quite connecting. The clay felt cool but truthful. I was refining the curve of a shoulder when I heard the garage door opening. Michael had returned early. He entered the basement without announcement. "Didn't realize you were down here," he said, surveying the space. I turned quickly, feeling exposed. Clay staining my shirt. He approached slowly. "You created this?" I nodded. "Something I used to pursue long ago." He studied the sculpture intently. "It's remarkable." That surprised me. Michael hadn't described anything I'd done as remarkable in years. "You never mentioned missing it." "I didn't think it was important," I answered honestly. Life became complicated. Children, responsibilities, schedules. He touched the sculpture's base delicately. Maybe we surrendered too much of ourselves. Something in his tone was different. Not detached, not mechanical - genuine. He turned toward me, truly observing me. "Is there another person?" I opened my mouth, closed it. "I simply need to understand," he said more softly. "Not in that way," I said. "But there is someone who helped me remember what it feels like to be acknowledged." Michael looked down. The silence between us grew profound. "Is it finished?" he asked. I didn't respond immediately because I was uncertain. But later that evening, I sat alone in our bedroom staring at a blank message to James. I wrote, "Thank you for helping me rediscover myself, but I need to attempt rebuilding what I've lost before I can begin something different." I sent it. No response came, but that was acceptable because this was no longer about him. That night, I joined Michael in the living room. No television, no distractions. Just us. We taught not surface conversation, but genuine discussion about who we were, who we'd become, what we'd lost. And as he reached over to clasp my hand, something settled within me. Not certainty, not absolution, but a beginning. Or maybe, just maybe,